Beautiful. Okay, so this talk is called State of the Neurotechnology Industry 2021. It's been an exciting year, not least because of the pandemic, but a lot has happened. Let's talk about some of the important events. Sorry about that. We're moving ahead too quickly. These are some of the key headlines from Neurotech Business Report. A lot happening with neurorehabilitation, a lot happening in depression research and neuromodulation for treating psychiatric disorders. There have been some IPOs, we'll talk about that, which is great for the investment community and for startups. A lot happening in the pain space, pain neuromodulation space, including both SCS and PNS devices. As we'll hear from Susan later on, a lot happening going on with bioelectronic medicine and the pharma industry. All right. For some reason, it's not showing slide 2. Let's see if I can do that. I want to talk a little bit about the first Neurotech Leaders Forum, happened 20 years ago. So we call this our Rip Van Winkle alert. Let's see if I can make that bigger. And on that first Neurotech Leaders Forum, we had about a dozen people. This was 3 weeks after 9/11, so you can imagine not the best time to launch a publication or a conference. But some of the things that we talked about at that first meeting 20 years ago was, well, what do we call this industry? And what do we include and what do we not include? And what about biotech? And what about pharma? And there were some divisions. There were people who wanted to include neuropharmaceuticals under the definition of neurotechnology. We, of course, stayed in the device world, at least for the moment. But those were some of the things that you discuss when you're launching a new industry. And there were 12 people. I want to go through some of the illustrious people who were at that first meeting. As it turns out, other than myself, only one of those original 12 is still working for the same firm that they were 20 years ago. And I believe that person is with us. And are you with us? If you are, unmute yourself. We'd love to hear you.
Yep. Yes, I'm still here.
Maybe not. Okay. So at any rate, Wendy Hutton, who was a VC with Mayfield Fund, she's still a VC, but with Kane & Partners now. Ann Bunnenberg was the CEO of a firm called EGI in Portland, which went through an acquisition. Philips bought the company, did well. Philips in turn spun that company off, and they're now part of Magstem. Who else was there? Edgar Island. He was working with Phil Kennedy, who had a company called Neurosignals. I think he still does. Edgar is now a successful financial professional in Atlanta. And Alan Gevins from SAM Technology. Not sure what he's doing these days, but he was one of the pioneers in the EEG industry. Okay, so just some of the key events from last year. Sorry. Oops. You did it. Okay, perfect.
I don't know if I get rid of the bar, but yeah.
All right, good work. Some of the key events of last year. one of the biggest, CMS made a decision on the MCIT program, which was part of the Breakthrough Device designation. In fact, the best part, right? And what MCIT would have done is, if you were Breakthrough Device designation product, you were essentially guaranteed that you'd get Medicare, CMS reimbursement for at least 4 years once your product was FDA approved. Well, unfortunately, CMS changed their mind. And part of that had to do with the changing administration. There was some distrust in the early days of the Biden administration for last minute executive orders that came from the Trump administration. This was one of them. However, the bigger issue was really pushback. There was pushback from a lot of medical professionals. The New England Journal of Medicine published a really scathing editorial that was criticizing the MCIT program. And then, as we'll hear from Paul LaViolette, there was concern that the FDA was just giving breakthrough designation to too many people. But it's not the end of the world. There's legislation that is pending, and it's also possible that CMS will revise the decision. It was basically all or nothing. They didn't have the option of modifying it. It was either accepting it or rejecting it, and they chose to reject it. I'm not going to talk too much about this because we have a panel devoted to the subject of reimbursement tomorrow. And that panel will be talking about that a little bit more. There's a gold rush in funding for BCI companies. Peter Thiel joined his internet colleagues, Elon Musk and Brian from Kernel. He invested $10 million in BlackRock Neurotech. BlackRock is not here in person, but I believe I was with us on Zoom. So feel free to chime in later during the discussion if you got more to add on that. Nasos, a company that was launched by the founder of Nevro, was launched. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the discussion on competitive battlegrounds. There was a proposed merger between Pixium Vision and Second Sight in the neuroprosthetics market. Unfortunately, that fell through. We like to say that Second Sight was the runaway bride. There's an interesting backstory, which if we have time, I'll get into a little bit later. Nevro got approved for entering the diabetes market, the PDN, painful diabetic neuropathy, and then a new company called Presidio. Michael Ackerman, many of you will remember as the founder of Aculeave, did really well, and they've got a new technology using ULF. And again, we're going to talk about ULF in the session on competitive battlegrounds. Okay, so this is an idea of what is the size of the market. Well, we see growth in the pain neuromodulation space. This is from our market research report, the market for implanted pain neuromodulation. We looked at to what extent PNS will be impacting SCS and vice versa. So you can see the blue on the bottom is the PNS market. Not very big right now, maybe going to $3 billion, you know, which is small compared to, sorry about that, compared to the SCS market, but it's definitely going to grow. So right now we see the total pain market is about 2.58 billion, growing to 3 billion next year, and 6 billion in 2026. And the PNS market, which is really less than 100 million today, that's going to grow to about 350 to 400 million by 2026, which is about a 42% CAGR. So a lot happening there. And again, we're going to talk about that in not the next session, but the one after. A lot happening in stroke rehabilitation. And this is exciting because Many of you will remember the failed North Star neuroscience trial from many years ago. North Star had attracted over $100 million in venture capital funding, gone public, and when their clinical trial for stroke rehabilitation failed, it not only brought the company down, it brought down the whole neurorehabilitation market. And it took years before investors could build up the courage to invest in a neurorehabilitation, a stroke rehabilitation product. But guess what? That chain of bad luck now seems to have been broken. And we now have microtransponder with FDA approval for their Vivastim paired VNS product for stroke rehabilitation. We also have some other vendors, BrainQ, using it, just an EMF, an electromagnetic field, coupled with some AI algorithms for doing stroke rehabilitation. There's a company called Phagenesis. They're doing pharyngeal electrical stimulation delivered through a catheter. Neurodevice Group in Poland, they're dealing with aphasia, which is one of the symptoms of post-stroke. Another company in the US called Neuromodulation, and they've marketed a hand exoskeleton, which we used to call neural re-education systems. In the psychiatric disorder market, some new players and some new approaches aside from the existing approaches using TMS. One of the most interesting and recent is a startup called Magnus Medical. They're using a new form of TMS licensed from Stanford University. And what makes that a little different and a little better, according to the Stanford studies, is they're using more pulses per session, 1,800 pulses instead of 600 pulses. Instead of just doing one session per day, they're doing 10-minute sessions. And what they're trying to do is establish a link between the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which all TMS vendors are targeting. But what they're trying to do is to pair that with activity in the subgenal cingulate cortex. So it's a different approach. It's new. Stanford has licensed it to this company called Magnus. And we're fortunate to have the CEO of Magnus with us tomorrow, talking on the psychiatric disorder session. Other vendors using different approaches. electroCore is using their non-invasive VNS to treat PTSD. They're in clinical trials. NeuroSigma has actually got FDA clearance for treating ADHD, pediatric ADHD with trigeminal nerve stimulation. There's an Israeli company called Neuraleaf that's in a pivotal trial for treating depression using TDCS. So we expect that TMS is going to have some competition on the non-invasive side. Of course, the holy grail is DBS for treating depression. We're not there yet, but we expect that that's going to come back. All right, some of the more significant market activity during the last year. NeuroPace had a successful IPO, raised over $100 million. There was an acquisition, a company called BioVentus acquired Bioness for $45 million. Now, honestly, that's not a huge win there. 45 million, it's okay, but it's not something that most investors are going to jump up and down about. But there's more to that story, and the story really is related to the death of Al Mann, which happened a few years ago, and the heirs of Al Mann, who owned Bioness, wanting to cash out. So that's not necessarily a good milestone for the industry, but some of the other exits are. One of which is Onward, a European company that went public on the Euronext exchange. 75 million euros, again, doesn't seem like a lot, but this is for a company in a market treating SCI, essentially, trying to restore function to paralyzed people, which years ago had no traction. Nobody would invest. Now, not only attracted a lot of investors, but did an exit for 75 million euro. The Australian company Cochlear invested in Precisis, a German company in the epilepsy market. Flow Neuroscience, we mentioned earlier, acquired Halo. Interestingly, Halo, the former CEO of Halo is Brett Weiniger, who will be with us tomorrow, and he is the founding CEO of Magnus Medical. So an interesting link there. A company called Zoll Medical bought Respicardia. Respicardia is a company that is treating central sleep apnea. I think I already mentioned BlackRock Neurotech, but in addition to the infusion of money that they've got, they've collaborated with a European company called Cortech, where they're kind of, it's not a merger, but they're collaborating on technologies that they're offering to the industry. A German pharma company, Merck KG, Susan, how do you say it? Merck KGA, is that it? Kaga, okay, Merck Kaga has collaborated with another European company called Neuroloop to treat inflammatory disorders. Why is this significant? Well, this is significant because GSK has invested heavily in Setpoint Medical, which is also in the inflammatory disorders market. So it'll be interesting to see, will there be some competition there? If you happen to be a subscriber or get your hands on the preview issue of Bioelectric Business Report, Susan Schaefer has done a very insightful article on the backstory on Merck Kaga, which I now know how to pronounce. Okay, some of the regulatory approvals that have happened in the last year. I've mentioned microtransponder already. I mentioned Nevro already. Medtronic got a European approval for their Sensite directional DBS leads. Another European company, Neuronica, now competing in the DBS marketplace. Spark Biomedical, I think they're here. Dan, are you here? Dan is on his way. He'll be presenting. When will Dan present? Tomorrow in the psychiatric disorder. They got approval for their addiction therapy. I mentioned Neuraleaf already with the headset. Helios Medical got a de novo approval for their tongue mounted stimulator for treating MS. So one of the first neuromodulation therapies approved for multiple sclerosis. And then another European company called Wise got approval for the cortical strip electrodes, and we're going to hear from their CEO, Luca Ravignan, tomorrow. I mentioned the FDA Breakthrough Devices, actually way more than could fit on the screen. Just a quick list of some of the noteworthy companies. I'm not going to go into them in great detail. Similarly, lots of VC funding activity, starting at the top. Mainstay at $100 million in one round. Nuspera in a Series C that brought in $65 million. And you can see here, you've got a range from 60s to 10, but there was a time when Series A's were, just a couple $1 million, and now we're seeing Series A's at 10 million, 18 million, 25 million, so I think that's a good sign. We've got some Series B's at 40 million. So gone are the days when it was impossible for neuromodulation startups to get VC interest. And as you can see from this admittedly limited list, lots of activity. Let's see, finally, we can't really talk about 2021 without mentioning some of the significant legal battles that are going on. One of the most interesting soap operas is the Stimwave versus the Perryman. So Laura Perryman, who was the founder of Stimwave, basically got fired in 2019. And that happened because the Department of Justice decided, oh, let's take a look at some of the goings on at Stimwave. And when that happened, Laura got fired, and then all kinds of allegations kept flying back and forth, including, oh my God, she's paying off her friends. She's paying for her son's apartment. They came in and illegally raided. Now, I actually had a chance to talk to Laura earlier this year. She started a new firm, and her contention is that, hey, she was trying to get the board to address the issues that DOJ brought, and the board wouldn't respond. Now, she was CEO at the time, but at any rate, there's a big lawsuit going on between Laura and StimWave, and part of it has to do with the fact that Laura, before she left the company, had a non-disclosure, I mean, not a non-disclosure, but an indemnification agreement that basically said, hey, if the CEO gets fired, you got to pay us up front for our legal fees. So, so StimWave, after Laura was gone, paid her $1 million. Well, it turned out there's some question as to the validity of that NDA, I mean, of that indemnification agreement. Anyway, I don't want to get into this. It's a soap opera. Medtronic Axonics, we've actually covered that in the most current issue of Neurotech Business Report, if you're a subscriber. And even if you're not, because we send it out 30 days later to everyone. But we've done our analysis, and we can talk, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the 11:15 panel. And most recently, Boston Scientific versus Nevro, there was a $20 million judgment. $20 million is a lot to you and I, but in a case like that, it's probably not the end of the world. But again, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the 11:15 session. So finally, I want to leave you with some noteworthy quotes. And this is actually, the first one is from 20 years ago. This is Wendy Hutton. Again, she's still in the industry. She's a VC with Canaan, but at the time she was at Mayfield Fund. And this is what she said: if you can follow the big kahuna leading the parade, and they've categorized things a certain way, I don't think a small group of fledgling companies should try to buck them. We, of course, were the small group of fledgling companies. And guess who the big kahuna was 20 years ago? And anyone want to hazard a guess? Nobody know. You're all stumped. It was Medtronic. Basically, they owned the neuromodulation industry, the pain side. They owned what was starting in DBS. And basically what Wendy was suggesting is, look, let's just follow their lead. Whatever they call neuromodulation or whatever they call neurotech, or neurostimulation, this is what we'll do. Let's not try and that's all well and good. But of course, if you've been following our publication for the last 20 years, you'll noted that Medtronic themselves have changed the definitions several times. Now, we're very fortunate because tomorrow we're going to hear from the president of Medtronic Neuromodulation, Dave Anderson, and when we'll have a chance to ask him, hey, what's the rationale behind this terminology and that, and how do we see that changing? But anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting quote. That was 20 years ago. I like this one. This is recent. Horse crap, it'll never work. That's Dan Powell. Dan Powell used to work for Cyberonics. Cyberonics made an implantable VNS system. And when they first found out about a non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation system, there was some consternation, although it turned out that Cyberonics actually invested in one of those companies, Cerbratech, the German company. But Dan was not impressed when he first saw it. Well, guess what Dan is doing now? Dan is doing non-invasive TA, transauricular vagus nerve stimulation. And we're going to hear from Dan tomorrow, so he can respond. That comment was made during the Cleveland Neurodesign Entrepreneurs Workshop, which just happened a few weeks ago in Cleveland. It was a great session. But at any rate, all right, here's a quote from the judge in the StimWave versus Perryman's case. Laura did not, in my opinion, testify truthfully. She came across as someone who had created a story to fit the facts. And what he was talking about there is this alleged backdating that took place on the indemnification agreement. In other words, maybe that indemnification agreement wasn't really enforced. It didn't become written until after Laura left the company. So that's one of the big issues involved in that lawsuit. And then finally, I think a very prescient comment from Paul LaViolette. Interestingly, Paul LaViolette is the person who fired Laura at StimWave. He was one of the investors in StimWave. Speaking of investors in StimWave, Paul Grand, are you with us? You were one of the early investors in StimWave. I know you're not anymore. You're off to bigger and better things, but maybe in the next session we can quiz you on that. But Paul LaViolette is now with a VC firm called SV Health Investors, a major VC, and he was the keynote speaker at the LSI Emerging MedTech Summit back in May of this year in Dana Point. And his quote turned out to be very prescient. He said, "It seems to be flowing perhaps a little bit too liberally. The rapidity with which breakthrough designations have been named has created consternation at CMS." And what I want to stress here is he made that comment in May, which was a full 5 months before CMS announced its decision. So did Paul know something that the rest of us didn't know? I think an interesting and relevant comment. Were they handing out these, was the FDA handing out these breakthrough designations willy-nilly? And as you saw from our slide on this subject, you know, we couldn't fit them all on there just within the neurotech space, let alone other areas of medical devices. Consternation, hey, look, someone's got to pay for that, and that would be CMS. So you got to wonder whether that was a factor in that decision. Again, we're going to talk about in more depth about where do we go from here with MCIT, because there are some options. But I thought that was kind of noteworthy. All right, we've got some really exciting topics coming up later today and tomorrow. Our next session is on the investment climate, and we're going to be talking about some of the exits that have taken place. Jeremy Koff is going to moderate that session. And but after that, it's going to be our session on neuromodulation battlegrounds. Victor Pika, Victor, are you here? Maybe he's on his way. He'll be joining Jeremy and Dan Brownstein and myself, and we're going to talk about, you know, some of these battlegrounds, including SCS, including PNS, including sacral nerve stimulation and others. I mentioned Susan Schaefer later today will be moderating a panel on big pharma and neurotech. Be an opportunity for her to talk about where she sees this new publication going. And we want to thank Susan for helping us get this new publication off the ground. If you haven't already, we do have a flyer out on the table talking about the new publication. We also have a session tomorrow, a very interesting session on wearable neurotech. So we have some companies involved in that. We also have an ex-FDA person who was involved with the regulation of wearable devices. She'll be joining us, and Heather Varan is going to be joining us, who is an actual clothing designer who has designed wearable. She's a professor at Fashion Institute and has worked with MIT as well. So that's going to be an interesting session, as will our final session tomorrow on the psychiatric market. So hopefully everyone can stay with us for all of our sessions today and tomorrow. So that kind of wraps up my talk. Happy to take any questions. I'm going to start with the Zoom audience. If you have a question for me in the Zoom audience, raise your virtual hand. And Laden, would you be kind enough to help me see if anyone has raised their hand? I don't see any hands. All right, is there anyone in the physical audience who wants to raise your actual hand if you have a question? Yes, go ahead.
So just a comment, more comment on Onward.
Yes.
That was the largest IPO, MedTech IPO in the history of Euronet.
Okay, I don't know. Zoom people, can you hear what Roger's, he had a comment, not a question. Let me just repeat what he said. It was the Onward IPO was the largest MedTech
IPO in the history of Euronet, with $101 million raised, and they now have a $450 million post-money valuation. Yeah,
so the largest MedTech IPO on the Euronext exchange. Of course, there are larger ones on NASDAQ, but that's an interesting point. Thank you, Roger. Anyone else in the room? Okay, and Laden, do we have anyone on Zoom with a question? All right, if not, I'm going to say thank you very much.